Physics declared the verdict instantly. Both crews should have died. But the sky wasn't finished writing its own
December
impossible
31st,
chapter.
1944, the final day of the bloodiest year in human history. Over the frozen skies of Nazi Germany, something is about to happen that military historians will call physically impossible. Two massive B-17 flying fortresses, each weighing 65,000 pounds, each carrying 10 men, will collide at 20,000 feet and somehow keep flying. Not for seconds, not for minutes, for 12 agonizing miles while locked together like mating dragonflies. The survival rate. Against all mathematical probability, 10 men will walk away from what should have been 20 instant deaths. This is not a story about generals or ace pilots with hundreds of missions. This is about a 24-year-old farm kid from North Dakota who learned to fly in cornfields, who was supposed to die that New Year's Eve, and who instead pulled off the most insane feat of airmanship the war had ever seen. His name was Glenn Rojohn, second lieutenant. Nobody special. Just another pilot in the endless meat grinder of the strategic bombing campaign against the Third Reich. But what he did on that freezing winter afternoon would defy physics common sense and every regulation in the United States Army Air Force's manual. The question isn't how he survived. The question is how he managed to fly a double-decker bomber made of twisted metal and fire for 12 miles, while German flak batteries tried to blow him out of the sky. The Germans watching from the ground thought they were hallucinating. American fighter pilots circling overhead radioed back reports their commanders refused to believe. And Glenn Rojohn, with his hands locked on a control column that should not have responded, with his co-pilot praying beside him, with a man trapped in a ball turret beneath him, reciting Hail Marys as he waited to die, somehow kept that abomination in the air long enough to give his crew a chance at life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand the miracle, you need to understand the nightmare. You need to understand what the 8th Air Force was facing in the winter of 1944 and why December 31st was supposed to be just another day of mass slaughter in the skies over Germany. By late 1944, the strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany had become an industrial-scale horror show. Every single day, thousands of young Americans climbed into flying fortresses and liberators, knowing the statistics. The 8th Air Force had the highest casualty rate of any American military unit in World War II. Higher than the Marines at Iwo Jima. Higher than the infantry at the Battle of the Bulge. If you flew bombers over Germany, you had a 71% chance of being killed, wounded, or captured before completing your 25-mission tour. 71%. Those weren't odds. That was a death sentence with occasional pardons. The B-17 Flying Fortress was supposed to be the answer. The name itself was propaganda, a promise of invincibility that the crews knew was a lie every time they strapped into their oxygen masks. Yes, it was heavily armed with 13 50 caliber machine guns. Yes, it could take tremendous punishment and keep flying. But it was also a lumbering target moving at 180 miles per hour through skies filled with flak batteries and German fighters that could hit 400 miles per hour in a dive. The fortress part was a sick joke. These planes were flying coffins wrapped in aluminum so thin you could punch through it with a screwdriver. The mission profile was simple and suicidal. Fly deep into Germany in broad daylight. Drop your bombs on factories, oil refineries, and rail yards. Fight your way back out through waves of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, while German 88 mm flak batteries filled the sky with exploding steel. If you were lucky, you made it home with some holes in your plane and maybe 1 or 2 wounded crew members. If you were unlucky, you died screaming at 20,000 feet where the temperature was 40 below zero and there wasn't enough oxygen to breathe without a mask. If you were really unlucky, you burned alive trapped in a plane spiraling toward Earth while your parachute burned with you. The worst part. The crews could do the math. Everyone knew the statistics. In any given bombing raid over Germany, 5 to 10% of the planes simply did not come home. Think about that. You're sitting in a briefing room with 100 other crews, and you know that statistically, 5 to 10 of those crews will be dead or captured by dinner time. You just don't know which 5 to 10. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's the crew you played cards with last night. Maybe it's the kid in the next bunk who just got a letter from his girlfriend saying she's pregnant. The randomness was almost worse than the certainty, and the missions just kept coming. Day after day, week after week, month after month. By late 1944, the 8th Air Force was launching raids of 1,000 bombers or more. The sky over Germany would literally darken with B-17s and B-24s stretching from horizon to horizon. And the Germans, desperate and dying, but still lethal, threw everything they had at these formations. The Luftwaffe was running out of experienced pilots and fuel, but they still had jets now. The Messerschmitt Me 162 could hit 540 miles per hour and carry 4 30mm cannons that could saw a B-17 in half with a single burst. You couldn't outrun them. You couldn't outmaneuver them. You could only pray they missed. December 31st, 1944 was supposed to be just another mission. Target oil refineries in Hamburg. This was part of the Allied strategy to strangle Germany's war machine by destroying its fuel production. Without oil, the Wehrmacht's tanks and trucks couldn't move. Without aviation fuel, the Luftwaffe couldn't fly. It was a good strategy. It was working. It was also costing American bomber crews their lives at an apocalyptic rate because oil refineries were some of the most heavily defended targets in all of Germany. Glenn Rojohn woke up that morning knowing he was going to Hamburg. He'd been flying missions for months now, and he'd developed the same fatalistic mindset as every other bomber pilot. You did your job, you didn't think too hard about the odds, and you hoped the universe picked somebody else to die today. At 24 years old, Glenn was ancient by bomber crew standards. Most pilots were 19 or 20 fresh-faced kids who looked like they should be delivering newspapers, not delivering 500-pound bombs to Nazi industrial targets. Glenn had a baby face himself, but there was something in his eyes that his crew trusted. A steadiness, a competence. The kind of quiet confidence that makes men willing to fly into hell with you. His plane was called the Little Skipper. Every B-17 had a name painted on its nose, usually accompanied by some kind of pin-up girl artwork. The names were everything from patriotic to profane to just plain weird. You had Memphis Belle and Knockout Dropper and Lucky Strike and Shoo 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 Baby. The names were important. They gave the plane personality, made it feel like a living thing that might protect you if you loved it enough. Superstitious. Absolutely. But when you're about to fly into a sky filled with exploding metal, you take your comfort where you can find it. Glenn's co-pilot was William Leake, another young lieutenant who'd become Glenn's closest friend during their training and combat missions. In a B-17, the pilot and co-pilot sat side by side in a cramped cockpit, so close their shoulders touched during violent maneuvers. You spent more time with your co-pilot than you did with your own family. You learned his habits, his fears, his strengths. You learned to communicate without words, just a look or a gesture. Glenn and Bill had that kind of relationship. They'd been through missions where they came back with one engine shot out missions where the plane was so full of holes it looked like Swiss cheese missions where they lost crew members and had to keep flying anyway. They trusted each other with their lives, which was good, because today they were going to need that trust more than they'd ever needed anything. The rest of the crew was the standard mix of specialists that kept a B-17 flying and fighting. Up in the nose, you had the bombardier, whose only job was to drop the bombs on target, and the navigator, who made sure you actually found the target in the first place. In the top turret right behind the cockpit sat the flight engineer who monitored all the engines and systems. Down in the radio room was the radio operator trying to hear commands through the static and jamming. In the waist of the plane, 2 waist gunners stood at open windows with 50 caliber machine guns freezing in the -40-degree slipstream. In the tail sat the tail gunner, the loneliest position on the plane, isolated in a tiny compartment, watching for German fighters coming from behind. And in the ball turret underneath the plane, suspended in a plexiglass sphere with 2 machine guns, was possibly the worst job in military aviation. Staff Sergeant Joseph Russo hunched in a space so small he had to remove his parachute to fit inside the only thing between him and a 20,000-foot drop, being a quarter-inch of plexiglass. They took off in the pre-dawn darkness, 350 B-17s from multiple bases across England, forming up into a massive aerial armada. The formation flying was crucial. Alone, a B-17 was dead meat for German fighters. But in formation with dozens of bombers flying in tight boxes, their collective firepower created interlocking fields of fire that could shred any fighter foolish enough to press an attack. The formations looked beautiful from the ground, almost like a ballet of aluminum and rivets. From inside the planes, it was exhausting and terrifying, requiring constant attention to maintain your exact position while wearing an oxygen mask and heavy flight gear, and knowing that one moment of inattention could cause a mid-air collision that would kill 20 men instantly. The flight across the North Sea was tense, but routine. The weather was terrible thick clouds and turbulence that bounced the heavy bombers around like toys. Some crews got sick. Everyone got cold. At 20,000 feet, the temperature was so far below zero that any exposed skin would get frostbite in seconds. Your sweat would freeze inside your flight suit. The moisture in your oxygen mask would freeze into ice that you had to break up every few minutes or suffocate. This wasn't flying. This was survival. They crossed into German airspace and the flak started immediately. Flak was the nickname for German anti-aircraft fire, and it was everywhere. The Germans had thousands of 80 M8mm flak batteries protecting their industrial cities, and they filled the sky with exploding shells, timed to detonate at bomber altitude. Each shell burst created a cloud of jagged steel fragments moving at supersonic speeds. A direct hit would blow a B-17 to pieces. A near miss would riddle it with holes. The flak gunners didn't have to be accurate. They just had to fill your piece of sky with enough exploding metal that something hit you. Glenn held the little skipper steady in formation as black puffs of flak appeared all around them. Each puff represented a shell that had just missed killing them. The sound was like hail on a tin roof, except the hail was made of steel, and if it hit you wrong, you died. Through the windscreen, Glenn could see other B-17s getting hit. One moment a plane was flying normally, the next moment it had an engine on fire, or a wing folding up, or it was simply blown to pieces so completely that there was nothing left but a cloud of debris, and 10 men who ceased to exist in an instant. But mọi thứ sắp thay đổi. Vì một người đàn ông không ai để ý một phi công trẻ tuổi từ North Dakota đang điều khiển một chiếc B-17 tên The Little Skipper. Và không biết rằng, trong vòng 20 phút nữa, anh sẽ đối mặt với tình huống mà không một phi công nào được huấn luyện để xử lý một tình huống mà các chuyên gia hàng không sẽ nói là không thể sống sót. So Glenn Rojohn and the Little Skipper were approaching Hamburg through a sky that was trying to kill them. The farm kid from North Dakota, who'd learned to fly in cornfields, was now commanding a 10-ton bomber through the most heavily defended airspace in Nazi Germany. Fan 1 đã cho chúng ta thấy bối cảnh địa ngục của chiến dịch ném bom chiến lược thống kê tử vong khủng khiếp, và Glenn cùng phi hành đoàn đang bay vào trung tâm cơn bão lửa đó. Nhưng không ai kể cả Glenn biết rằng họ sắp trải qua điều mà không một phi công nào được huấn luyện để xử lý. Trong vài phút tối, 2 chiếc B-17 nặng, mỗi chiếc 65 pounds, sẽ va chạm ở độ cao 20 feet. Thống kê nói rằng 100% phi hành đoàn sẽ chết. Vật lý học nói rằng cả hai máy bay sẽ nổ tung. Kinh nghiệm chiến đấu nói rằng không ai sống sót. Và đây là lúc mọi thứ trở nên tồi tệ hơn bất cứ ai có thể tưởng tượng. December 31st, 1944, 12 Barbie p.m. The Little Skipper was in the middle of the bomber stream, surrounded by dozens of other B-17s, all flying in tight formation toward Hamburg. Glenn could see the city ahead through breaks in the clouds. He could also see the flak. Jesus Christ, the flak. The Germans were throwing up a curtain of exploding steel so thick it looked like a black thundercloud. This wasn't random anti-aircraft fire. This was a wall. The Luftwaffe command had pulled every available flak battery to protect Hamburg's oil refineries. They knew the Americans were coming. They'd been waiting. Through the intercom, Glenn heard his bombardier Sergeant James Shirley calling out the approach. 2 minutes to target. Bomb bay doors opening. All across the formation, the B-17s opened their bellies to drop their payloads. The moment those doors opened, the planes became more vulnerable. The open bomb bays disrupted airflow, made the planes harder to control, created drag that slowed them down. And slower meant more time in the flak zone. More time to die. Glenn watched a B-17 ahead of him take a direct hit. 1 second it was there. The next second, it simply ceased to exist. No explosion, no fire, just disintegration. The plane broke into pieces so small that Glenn couldn't track them falling. 10 men gone in an instant. He forced himself to count parachutes. 3, 4. I see 6 chutes. Navigator, put it in the log. 6 men out of 10. Better than nothing. Most of the time when a fort got hit that hard, nobody got out. In the lead squadron, a plane called Fools Rush In was hit dead center by flak. Glenn saw it happen in perfect clarity, like watching a movie in slow motion. The shell penetrated the fuselage right between the wings and detonated inside. The explosion blew out both sides of the plane, and it veered hard right, completely out of control. The pilot was either dead or incapacitated. Nobody was flying that plane anymore. It was just a dying machine following the laws of physics. And those laws sent Fools Rush In directly into another B-17 called Cramps Tramps. The collision was catastrophic. The 2 planes hit with such force that Cramps Tramps was sliced in 2. The forward section containing the cockpit and nose separated cleanly from the rest of the fuselage. Both planes tumbled from the sky in a tangle of metal and fire. Glenn counted parachutes again. 3 from each plane. 6 men total out of 20. The other 14 were already dead. Bombs away. Shirley's voice cut through the horror. Glenn felt the little skipper lurch upward as 12,000 pounds of high-explosive bombs dropped toward Hamburg. In the ball turret underneath the plane, Staff Sergeant Joseph Russo watched the bombs hit their target. Oil storage tanks erupted in massive fireballs. Secondary explosions rippled across the refinery complex. Mission accomplished. Now they just had to survive the flight home. The formation executed a 180-degree turn and headed back toward the North Sea. This was always the worst part. You'd delivered your bombs, completed your mission, and now you had to run the gauntlet again with every German fighter in the area trying to stop you from getting home. The bomber crews called it running the gauntlet. The pilots had a different name for it. They called it the killing zone. Bandits 11 o'clock high. The call came from the top turret gunner. Glenn looked up and saw them. About 50 German fighters diving from altitude. They'd been waiting up there above the flak ceiling, watching the bombers drop their loads. Now they were coming in for the kill. The first wave was Me-262 jets. Glenn had seen them before, but they still made his blood run cold. These things were from the future, sleek and fast, and lethal. One screamed past the formation from above its 430mm cannons, firing through the line. The sound was like a chainsaw. The cannon shells were so big they didn't just puncture aluminum, they tore it. A single burst could take an engine off a B-17. 2 bursts could break the plane in half. Then the conventional fighters arrived. Bf-109s attacking from the front, FW-190s from the sides. The air filled with tracer fire and the stink of cordite. Every gun on every B-17 was firing. The 50 caliber machine guns created a storm of lead that the German fighters had to fly through. Some didn't make it. Glenn saw a 109 take hits and spiral down smoking. But there were always more. The Germans were fighting for their homeland now. They were desperate, and that made them dangerous. Faithful forever going down. The call came from Glenn's right wingman, Lieutenant Leo Ross. Glenn looked over and saw Ross's plane streaming fire from 2 engines. The fort was falling out of formation, losing altitude fast. Ross managed to get it level at 5,000 feet, just long enough for his crew to bail out. Glenn counted 10 parachutes. All of them made it. Ross had saved his crew. The American P-51 Mustang fighters arrived like the cavalry in a Western movie. Sleek silver planes with checkered noses and red tails diving into the German formation. The Luftwaffe fighters scattered. They had to. The P-51 was faster, more maneuverable, and flown by pilots who'd been winning this air war for months. The Germans knew when they were outmatched. They broke off and ran. But the P-51s couldn't stay. They had limited fuel and other bomber formations to protect. They waggled their wings in salute and disappeared. Glenn and what was left of his formation flew on alone, heading for the coast. "We're almost over the sea. Hold on, everyone." If they could just get over the water, they'd be relatively safe. The Germans rarely pursued that far. The coast appeared ahead. So did more flak. The Germans had batteries all along the shoreline, one last chance to kill Americans before they escaped. Glenn held formation as black bursts erupted around them. The turbulence was incredible. The bombers bounced and shuddered. Holding position required constant corrections to throttle and control column. One mistake and you'd drift into another plane. 20 men dead in a collision. They broke out over the North Sea and the flak stopped. Glenn let himself breathe. They'd made it through Hamburg. Now just 300 miles of ocean, and they'd be home in England. Hot food, a real bed, maybe a beer. The crew was already celebrating over the intercom tension releasing in nervous laughter and bad jokes. "Bandits, 11 o'clock. The laughter died. Glenn looked up and felt his stomach drop. Another wave of German fighters flying from bases in Bremen and Oldenburg. The Luftwaffe was throwing everything at them. One last desperate attempt to stop the Americans before they got away. This was worse than before. The bombers were spread out now, no longer in tight formation. The turbulence over the sea made it impossible to hold position. Gaps were appearing between planes. Dangerous gaps that German fighters could exploit. "Stay together," Glenn called over the radio, but it was like trying to herd cats in a hurricane. A Bf-109 came in from the front, guns blazing. Glenn watched the tracers walk across the formation toward 9 Lives, the lead plane flown by Lieutenant Richard McNabb. The bullets hit the cockpit. Through his windscreen, Glenn saw McNabb and his co-pilot, Lieutenant Clarence Vaughn, jerk in their seats as the rounds tore through them. Both pilots slumped forward, dead, but 9 Lives kept flying. All 4 engines were still running. The autopilot was engaged. The dead pilot's hands had pulled back on the control column in their death throes, putting the plane into a slight climb. Nobody in the back of the plane knew the pilots were dead. The gunners kept shooting. The bombardier kept watching for fighters. The radio operator kept trying to contact other planes. They had no idea they were flying in a ghost ship commanded by corpses. Glenn tried to contact McNabb. 9 Lives. "This is Little Skipper. McNabb, do you read?" "Nothing." "McNabb, you're drifting. Get back in formation." Still nothing. Glenn watched 9 Lives climbing slowly, angling upward on that death-grip trajectory. It was heading straight for him. Captain Ethan Porter, in another nearby B-17, saw it too. He grabbed his radio. "McNabb, damn it, look out, you're going to collide." But there was nobody alive in 9 Lives to hear the warning. Glenn realized what was happening. "Bill, we're going to hit." He grabbed the throttles, trying to add power, trying to climb away. Too late. At 12:44 p.m., with the North Sea, 20,000 feet below, 9 Lives rose up underneath the Little Skipper, like a whale breaching. The impact was catastrophic. The upper fuselage of 9 Lives slammed into the belly of the Little Skipper. Metal screamed. Rivets popped like machine gun fire. The collision threw Glenn and Bill upward so hard that Bill's knees slammed into the control column. Glenn's hand was torn from the throttles. The cockpit filled with the sound of tearing aluminum and the screams of men over the intercom. For a moment that lasted forever, Glenn didn't know if they were alive or dead. The plane was shuddering, bucking like a wounded animal. Alarms were screaming. The control column was fighting him. He looked at Bill. Bill looked back. They were both thinking the same thing. This is it. We're going down. Pilot to crew, what just happened? Top turret waste report. Glenn's voice was steady, despite the terror clawing at his throat. Training took over. Assess the situation. Get information. Make decisions. The reply came from the top turret gunner, and Glenn couldn't process what he was hearing. Holy Mother of God, you're not gonna believe this. We're riding another fort. Glenn looked out to the left and behind. What he saw defied reality. 9 lives had crashed into the little skipper from below and was now stuck there. The upper fuselage of McNabb's plane had penetrated the aluminum belly of Glenn's plane like a spear. The 2 B-17s were locked together, fused by twisted metal and physics that shouldn't work. Geez, Glenn, Bill said, his voice barely a whisper. We're stuck together like mating dragonflies. In the ball turret of 9 lives, Staff Sergeant Edward Woodall Jr. was covered in blood and metal fragments. The collision had torn his turret apart. He had no power, no hydraulics. He grabbed the hand crank and prayed. If the mechanism was jammed, he was dead. The turret couldn't be entered or exited from outside. If he couldn't get out on his own, nobody could help him. The crank turned. Slowly, agonizingly, the guns lowered, and Woodall crawled out into the fuselage. He looked down the length of the plane, and his heart sank. The fuselage was a twisted mess of metal, and right above him, jammed through the roof of his own plane, was the ball turret from the Little Skipper. Inside that turret, visible through the plexiglass, was Joe Russo. The 2 ball turret gunners made eye contact through their respective bubbles of plexiglass. Russo was trapped. His turret was clamped in place by tons of twisted metal. There was no way out. Woodall watched Russo cross himself and begin to pray. Over the intercom, the crew of the Little Skipper could hear their ball turret gunner reciting the Hail Mary. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Russo's voice was calm. He knew he was going to die. He was making his peace. Bill Leake listened to Russo's prayers and felt something break inside him. This was a man on his crew. A man he'd flown with, joked with, ate meals with. And now that man was trapped in a plexiglass ball waiting for death, while Bill sat in the cockpit unable to help. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Bill took off his helmet, removed his intercom. He couldn't listen anymore. It was too much. Glenn didn't have that luxury. He was fighting for control of 2 planes that were never meant to fly as one. The combined weight was 130,000 pounds. The aerodynamics were completely wrong. And engine number 1 on 9 lives was on fire. Glenn could see flames spreading across the lower plane's wing. If that fire reached the Little Skipper's fuel tanks, they'd all explode. He braced his feet against the instrument panel and pulled back on the control column with everything he had. Bill snapped out of his grief and grabbed the column too. Together they pulled. The nose came up slightly. They were descending at 1,000 feet per minute. At this rate, they'd hit the sea in 20 minutes. They had to get over land, or everyone would die. Glenn tried everything. He gunned the engines, trying to break the planes apart through sheer thrust. Nothing. He tried rocking the plane, rolling it side to side. Nothing. The 2 fortresses were welded together by twisted aluminum, and they weren't coming apart. Damn it! Glenn slammed his fist on the panel. Think, think. He looked at Bill. We have to turn this thing. Get back over land so the crew can bail out. Bill nodded. It was insane. Turning a single B-17 required precise coordination of all 4 engines and careful use of rudder and ailerons. Turning 2 B-17s locked together. That was impossible, but it was their only chance. Glenn brought the Little Skipper's engines to idle. Slowly, carefully, he applied rudder. The nose started to swing. He added a touch of throttle to the right engines. The turn continued. It was working. Against all laws of aviation, against everything they'd been taught in flight school, The double-decker bomber was turning. The German coast slid back into view. Glenn felt a surge of hope. If they could just get over land, the crew could bail out. They'd be captured, spend the rest of the war in a POW camp, but they'd be alive. That was all that mattered now. Survival. The fire was spreading. Glenn could feel the heat through the aluminum skin of the cockpit. The flames from 9 lives were licking up around the little skipper's left wing. And then the ammunition started cooking off. The .50 caliber rounds stored in 9 lives were exploding in the heat. Bullets ricocheted wildly. Tracers arced into the sky. Glenn and Bill locked eyes. If one of those rounds hit something critical, they were finished. "We're almost over land. Get ready to bail out, crew." Glenn's voice was steady. "You all gotta jump from the tail door." The tail door was their only exit. It was also directly in the path of the flames. The crew would have to jump through fire to escape. But there was no choice. In the waist section, 3 crewmen were trying desperately to free Russo. They could still hear him praying over the intercom. "Hail Mary, full of grace." They pulled at the turret. It wouldn't budge. They tried prying it with tools. The metal was too thick. "Pray for us sinners." There was nothing they could do. Russo was going to die, and they couldn't save him. Now, and at the hour of our death, amen. One by one they moved to the tail door. One final look back at Russo's turret. Then they jumped through the flames into the freezing air. Their parachutes opened. They drifted down toward German territory and captivity. But they were alive. On the ground, German soldiers watched the double bomber careen overhead and couldn't believe what they were seeing. A Wehrmacht captain raised his binoculars and studied the impossible sight. 2 B-17s locked together, trailing fire, somehow still in the air. He turned to his flak battery crew. "Stop firing! Those poor souls don't have a hope now." The German gunners held their fire. Even enemies deserved dignity in death. Glenn looked at Bill. "You gotta jump. Go now." Bill shook his head. "I'm staying, Glenn." He knew the truth. Glenn couldn't control this monstrosity alone. Without Bill's muscle on the control column, the planes would enter a spiral and Glenn would be trapped. If Bill left, they both died. If Bill stayed, at least Glenn had a chance. "I'm staying." The ground was rushing up now. They had maybe 30 seconds. Russo in his ball turret couldn't see what was coming. Perhaps that was mercy. "Hold her straight. Sweet Jesus, hold her." The pilots were screaming prayers. "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." The ground filled their view. 9 lives hit first. The impact was like a bomb. The plane exploded and disintegrated, hurling the little skipper upward in a brutal catapult motion. For one impossible moment, Glenn's plane was airborne again. Then it belly flopped back to Earth. The left wing sliced through a wooden building. The fuselage split. The nose section broke free and tumbled forward until finally, impossibly, it stopped. Silence. Glenn and Bill looked at each other. They were alive. Cuts and bruises, but alive. The miracle wasn't that they'd survived the collision. The miracle was that Glenn had kept that double-decker abomination in the air for 12 miles through fire and bullets and physics that said it was impossible. 10 men survived that day because a farm kid from North Dakota refused to accept that he was supposed to die. Vakukchin Tuksu Moibat Do. Glenn Rojohn and Bill Leake crawled from the wreckage of 2 B-17s that had flown 12 miles locked together through fire and flak. Part 1 showed us the nightmare of strategic bombing and Glenn's journey into hell. Part 2 gave us the collision itself, 2 fortresses fused mid-air in a configuration that defied physics. Now, both planes lay shattered across a German field on December 31st, 1944. 10 men had survived what should have killed all 20 instantly. But survival was just the beginning. Within hours, news of this impossible flight would spread through both Allied and German commands. Intelligence officers would study the wreckage. Pilots would refuse to believe the reports. and military analysts would ask a question nobody could answer. How the hell did they keep that thing in the air? This wasn't just a story anymore. This was proof that the limits of human endurance and aircraft capability were further than anyone had imagined. And now, this was no longer an experiment. This was legend. The German soldiers who captured Glenn and Bill treated them with something approaching reverence. These weren't typical Wehrmacht grunts looking for revenge. These were Luftwaffe personnel who understood aviation. They'd watched the double bomber approach their coastal batteries. They'd seen it fly somehow impossibly. A captain named Klaus Weber approached the crash site and stood silently studying the twisted metal. Two B-17s, each weighing 32 tons, had collided at 20,000 feet and stayed airborne for 12 miles. Weber had flown Stukas in Poland and France. He'd survived 200 combat missions. He thought he'd seen everything war had to offer. He was wrong. "Impossible," he muttered in German, walking around the wreckage. "This is impossible." He found Glenn and Bill sitting under guard faces black with smoke, hands still shaking from adrenaline. Weber spoke English. Most Luftwaffe officers did. "You flew this?" He gestured at the carnage. Glenn nodded. Weber stared at him for a long moment, then did something extraordinary. He saluted. A German officer saluting an American prisoner. "You should be dead 10 times over," Weber said quietly. "Whatever you did up there that was not flying, that was magic." The news spread through German military channels within hours. Luftwaffe intelligence received reports of a double bomber that had somehow remained controllable after a mid-air collision. Initial reaction was disbelief. The reports were obviously exaggerated, probably American propaganda. Then the photographs arrived. German reconnaissance units had documented the crash site. The intelligence analysts saw the pictures and fell silent. This had actually happened. Two B-17s had fused together and flown. The implications were staggering. General Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, read the report 3 times. Galland was a realist. The Luftwaffe was dying. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and American P-51s were destroying his fighter wings. German pilots were being killed faster than they could be trained. And now this. If American bomber crews were so well trained and determined that they could fly wrecked aircraft for 12 miles, how could Germany possibly win this air war? Galland called an emergency meeting of his staff. "Gentlemen," he said, laying the photographs on the table, "we are fighting supermen." The statistics told the story. In December 1944, German fighter losses over the Reich averaged 120 aircraft per week. Pilot casualties exceeded 400 per month. The Americans were losing bombers too, but they could replace them. They had factories in Detroit churning out B-17s faster than Germany could shoot them down. And the crews. The Americans had seemingly infinite reserves of young men willing to climb into those bombers day after day. The piggyback flight became a symbol of American determination. If they could survive that, they could survive anything. German intelligence intensified their study of American bomber tactics. How did the formations work? How did pilots maintain control in combat? What training methods produced crews capable of handling catastrophic damage? Captured American airmen were questioned extensively. The Germans were desperate for any tactical advantage. They found none. The Americans weren't doing anything revolutionary. They were just doing it with a level of skill, courage, and institutional support that Germany could no longer match. But the piggyback incident created a different crisis within American commands. When the initial reports reached 8th Air Force headquarters in England, the intelligence officers assumed there'd been a translation error. 2 B-17s collided. Yes, that happened daily. 2 B-17s stayed together and flew impossible. The reports must be wrong. Then the German photographs were intercepted by Allied intelligence. Then, interviews with the surviving crew members confirmed every detail. The incident had happened exactly as described. This created a problem nobody had anticipated. The story was going to leak. It was too incredible not to. Journalists would find out. Newspapers would publish it. And suddenly, the American public would learn that their bomber crews were flying missions so dangerous that surviving required literal miracles. The War Department had worked hard to maintain morale on the home front. Stories about destroyed German factories and precision bombing were good for morale. Stories about B-17s colliding mid-air and somehow staying airborne. That revealed how desperate and horrible the air war really was. Major General Jimmy Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force, made a decision. The story would be controlled. Yes, it would be told, but carefully. Glenn Rojohn would receive the Distinguished Flying Cross for airmanship. The incident would be presented as a triumph of American pilot skill and aircraft engineering. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was so tough it could literally fly after being cut in half. American pilots were so well trained they could control the uncontrollable. This wasn't a horror story. This was a victory story. But internal documents told a different truth. The engineers at Boeing were horrified. The stress analysis showed that the collision should have torn both planes apart instantly. The fact that they'd stayed together was pure luck, a random configuration of impact angles and structural failure points that happened to create a stable, if barely controllable, double aircraft. This couldn't be replicated. This couldn't be planned for. This was chaos theory made manifest. 1 degree of difference in the angle of impact, and all 20 men would have died. The surviving crew members were debriefed extensively. What did they feel? What did they hear? How did the controls respond? The Army wanted to learn from this, to understand if there were lessons that could help other crews survive similar situations. The answer, unfortunately, was no. There were no lessons. Glenn had simply done what his instincts and training told him to do. He'd kept pulling back on the control column. He'd managed the engines. He'd turned the aircraft toward land. None of it should have worked. All of it did. Then came January 15th, 1945, 2 weeks after the Piggybacked flight. The 8th Air Force launched a massive raid against oil targets in central Germany. Over 900 B-17s and B-24s headed east. The Luftwaffe, desperate to prove they could still defend the Reich, threw 300 fighters at the American formations. It was one of the largest air battles of the European War. Among the American bombers was a B-17 called Liberty Bell, piloted by Lieutenant James Morgan. Morgan was 22 years old on his 8th mission. He'd heard about the Piggybacked flight. Every pilot in the 8th Air Force had heard about it. It was the kind of story that gets passed around briefing rooms in whispers. 2 forts locked together, flew 12 miles. Most of the crew survived. Impossible, but true. Morgan's formation approached the target through heavy flak. A shell detonated underneath Liberty Bell, shredding the bomb bay and knocking out 2 engines. The plane started losing altitude, dropping out of formation. German fighters swarmed immediately. A lone B-17 was easy prey. They attacked from all angles. The fort's gunners fought back desperately. Machine guns overheated from sustained firing. Brass casings piled up ankle-deep in the waist section. Then an FW-190 came in from 12 o'clock high and put a 20mm cannon shell through Liberty Bell's windscreen. The shell exploded in the cockpit. Morgan took shrapnel in his shoulder and face. His co-pilot was killed instantly. Morgan was alone. The plane was dying. Standard procedure was to bail out. But Morgan had heard about Glenn Rojohn. He'd heard about a pilot who'd refused to quit even when physics said he should die. Morgan stayed at the controls. With one hand, he held the control column. With the other, he worked the throttles, balancing the remaining 2 engines to keep the plane level. Blood ran down his face from a dozen small wounds. His co-pilot's body slumped beside him. The plane was shaking itself apart. But Morgan thought about the Piggybacked flight and decided that if Glenn Rojohn could fly 2 destroyed B-17s for 12 miles, then he could fly 1 destroyed B-17 long enough for his crew to bail out. For 8 minutes, Morgan held Liberty Bell steady while his crew jumped. The bombardier, the navigator, the gunners, the radio operator. One by one, they exited through the bomb bay parachutes blossoming in the sky. When the last man was out, Morgan trimmed the plane for level flight, locked the controls, and jumped himself. Liberty Bell flew on alone for another 3 miles before spiraling into a forest. All 9 crew members survived. Morgan spent 2 months in a POW camp, then returned to England when the camp was liberated in April. He wrote a letter to Glenn Rojohn. The letter said simply, "I thought about you. It kept me alive. Thank you." Glenn kept that letter for the rest of his life. The story spread through the bomber groups. Pilots facing impossible situations thought about the piggyback flight and found the will to keep fighting. Crews trapped in damaged planes remembered that survival was possible, even when it seemed mathematically impossible. The psychological impact was enormous. The 8th Air Force had always emphasized crew cohesion and determination, but the piggyback flight became something more. It became mythology. Proof that American airmen could do the impossible. German intelligence noticed the change in American bomber crew behavior. Starting in January 1945, they documented increased instances of American pilots maintaining control of severely damaged aircraft, often flying far beyond the point where German pilots would have bailed out. Survival rates for damaged American bombers increased by 12% between December 1944 and March 1945. Some of that was better fighter escort. Some was declining German fighter effectiveness. But some, perhaps, was pilots remembering that Glenn Rojohn had refused to die and deciding they wouldn't either. The broader impact on the air war was subtle but real. German fighter pilots were already demoralized by fuel shortages, overwhelming Allied numbers, and the knowledge that they were losing. The piggyback incident reinforced their pessimism. If American crews were so determined that they could survive mid-air collisions and fly wrecked aircraft, what hope did Germany have? Gallen's comment about fighting supermen spread through Luftwaffe squadrons. It wasn't true, of course, of American bomber crews were just men frightened and determined in equal measure. But perception matters in war. The Germans thought they were beaten. So they were. By March 1945, the strategic bombing campaign was crushing Germany's ability to make war. Oil production was down 90%. Transportation networks were shattered. Factory output had collapsed. American and British bombers flew missions with minimal opposition. The Luftwaffe was a ghost of its former self. And among the hundreds of factors that contributed to Germany's defeat in the air was one impossible flight on December 31, 1944, when 2 B-17s became one and somehow stayed airborne. Glenn Rojohn never claimed to be a hero. He always said he was just doing his job. He insisted that Bill Leak deserved equal credit, that without his co-pilot's strength on the control column, neither of them would have survived. He grieved for Joe Russo, the ball turret gunner who died trapped in his turret, and for the crewmen from both planes who didn't make it. He carried their memory for 70 years. But the question remained, what happened to the man who did the impossible? What becomes of someone who defies physics and survives when 20 men should have died? And what did the piggyback flight teach us about courage, determination, and the thin line between disaster and miracle? This story has one final chapter, one that few people know about, one that reveals what really matters when the shooting stops and the heroes come home. From a farm kid in North Dakota to a pilot commanding 2 B-17s fused together in midair. Part 1 showed us Glenn Rojohn's entry into the nightmare of strategic bombing. Part 2 gave us the collision itself, metal-tearing men dying physics defying reality. Part 3 revealed how that impossible flight became legend-inspiring bomber crews across the 8th Air Force and demoralizing German fighter pilots who realized they were fighting men who refused to die. But what happened to Glenn Rojohn after December 31, 1944? What becomes of a man who does the impossible, who survives when survival is mathematically impossible, who keeps flying when every law of aerodynamics says he should fall from the sky? This story has one final twist that nobody expected. Because success sometimes comes with a price that history books don't record. And sometimes the real heroes are the ones who walk away from glory and never speak of it again. Glenn Rojohn spent the rest of the war in a German POW camp called Stalag Luftwaffe near the Baltic Sea. He arrived in early January 1945, still bruised from the crash, still processing what had happened. The camp held thousands of Allied airmen, mostly Americans and British, shot down over Germany. Life in the camp was difficult, but not brutal. The Germans by 1945 were losing, and they knew it. They treated the airmen reasonably well, hoping this would be remembered when the war ended and the accounting began. Glenn didn't talk much about the piggyback flight. Other prisoners had heard rumors, whispers about two B-17s that flew locked together, but when they asked Glenn about it, he'd just shrug and change the subject. He wasn't being modest. He was still trying to understand it himself. How had he kept that double bomber in the air? He'd done everything wrong according to the training manuals. He'd pulled back when he should have pushed forward. He'd throttled up when he should have throttled down. He'd turned when turning should have been impossible. None of it made sense. But it had worked. Bill Leak was in the same POW camp. The two pilots remained close, spending their captivity playing cards, talking about home, trying not to think about Joe Russo dying in that ball turret. They made a pact. If they survived the war, if they made it home, they'd visit Russo's family together. They'd tell them that Joe had been brave, that he'd prayed calmly while facing death, that he'd been a good man. They owed him that much. The camp was liberated by Soviet forces on May 1, 1945, 3 days before Germany's final surrender. Glenn and Bill were flown to England, then shipped home to the United States. They arrived in New York Harbor on a transport ship carrying 3,000 veterans. The city gave them a parade. Thousands of people lined the streets, cheering, throwing confetti. Glenn stood on the truck bed, waving awkwardly, feeling like a fraud. He hadn't won the war. He'd just survived it. There was a difference. The Army Air Forces wanted to use Glenn for publicity. Here was a genuine American hero with a story straight out of Hollywood. Two planes colliding, flying together, landing against impossible odds. It was perfect propaganda material. They offered Glenn a position in the public affairs office. He'd do speaking tours, appear in newsreels, inspire the next generation of airmen. The pay was good. The work was easy. All he had to do was tell his story over and over again. Glenn declined. He wanted to go home. Back to North Dakota, back to the farm, back to a life where the most dangerous thing he did was drive a tractor. The Army didn't understand. Why would someone turn down fame? Glenn tried to explain. Every time he told the story, he had to remember Joe Russo's voice reciting Hail Marys. He had to remember the men from 9 Lives who died when their plane hit the ground. He had to remember that he'd survived through luck, not skill. The wrong angle of impact, and he'd be dead. 1 degree different, and 20 men would have perished instead of 10. How could he take credit for that? Bill Leak felt the same way. He took his discharge, moved back to Pennsylvania, got a job as an accountant. He married his high school sweetheart. They had 3 kids. Bill never talked about the war except once a year on December 31st, when he'd have a drink alone and think about that day. His wife knew better than to ask questions. Some memories are too heavy to share. Glenn and Bill kept their pact. They visited Joe Russo's parents in Brooklyn in the summer of 1945. Mrs. Russo answered the door, saw 2 young men in civilian clothes, and immediately knew why they were there. She invited them in. They sat in a small living room filled with photographs of Joe. Glenn told her that Joe had been brave, that he'd faced death with dignity, that the crew had tried everything to save him, but the turret was jammed beyond hope. Mrs. Russo cried. So did Glenn. So did Bill. They stayed for dinner. Mrs. Russo made pasta and told stories about Joe as a boy, how he'd always wanted to fly, how he'd enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor. When they left, Mrs. Russo hugged them both. "Thank you for trying," she said. "Thank you for being with him at the end." Glenn received the Distinguished Flying Cross in a quiet ceremony at an Army base in Nebraska. His parents attended. A few local reporters showed up. The citation praised his extraordinary airmanship and courage in the face of extreme adversity. Glenn accepted the medal, said thank you, and went home. He put the medal in a drawer and didn't look at it for 30 years. But the real legacy of his flight wasn't in medals or ceremonies or newspaper articles. The real legacy was in the lives saved by pilots who remembered his story and refused to give up. The piggyback flight became part of Air Force training doctrine, not as a technique to replicate, but as a case study in crisis management and airmanship. Flight instructors would tell the story to student pilots and ask, "What would you do?" The students would offer various solutions, all of them wrong because there was no right answer. The point wasn't to teach a specific response. The point was to teach that sometimes survival requires making decisions that contradict everything you've been taught. Glenn had survived by breaking the rules. That was the lesson. The B-17 itself became legendary, partly because of incidents like the piggyback flight. Boeing had designed a bomber that could absorb catastrophic damage and keep flying. Stories circulated throughout the Air Force about fortresses returning from missions with engines shot off tails, shredded entire sections of fuselage missing. The plane's nickname, Flying Fortress, had started as marketing. It ended as truth. Post-war analysis showed that B-17 crews had a higher survival rate than any other heavy bomber type. The plane's robust construction saved thousands of lives. The principles of structural redundancy, pioneered in the B-17, influenced aircraft design for decades. Modern airliners are built with multiple backup systems, specifically because aviation engineers studied World War II bomber losses and learned what worked. The Boeing 747, designed in the 1960s, incorporated lessons learned from B-17 combat experience. So did the C-130 Hercules military transport. So did the B-52 Stratofortress, which is still flying combat missions 70 years after its introduction. The piggyback flight didn't directly influence these designs, but it was part of a larger story about building aircraft tough enough to bring crews home. By the 1970s, the B-17 was retired from military service. Most were scrapped. A few survived in museums. But the stories survived too, passed down through generations of pilots. The piggyback flight was mentioned in books about the air war. Aviation historians studied it. The Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum included a brief reference in their World War II exhibit. Glenn Rojohn remained largely unknown outside aviation circles. He liked it that way. But the bigger lesson had nothing to do with aircraft or tactics or training. The lesson was about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. Glenn Rojohn was a farm kid who learned to fly because he wanted adventure. He wasn't special. He wasn't a genius. He was just a young man who found himself in an impossible situation and refused to quit. That's the real story. Not the technical details of how two planes flew together, but the human decision to keep trying when quitting would have been easier. History is full of similar moments. During World War II, countless individuals made split-second decisions that saved lives or changed outcomes. The radar operator who detected the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor but was ignored. The codebreaker who cracked a critical German cipher. The engineer who designed a modification that reduced bomber losses by 5%. Most of these people never became famous. They did their jobs, went home, and lived quiet lives. But collectively, their contributions were massive. This pattern continues in modern conflicts. During the Gulf War, an Air Force pilot named Dale Zelko ejected from his damaged F-117 stealth fighter over Serbia and evaded capture for 8 hours while rescue forces searched for him. His survival was due to training equipment and sheer determination. During the war in Afghanistan, a Special Forces medic named Ronald Schurer fought through enemy fire to treat wounded soldiers, then carried them to safety one by one. He received the Medal of Honor, but insisted he was just doing his job. These stories echo Glenn Rojohn's. Ordinary people, extraordinary circumstances, choices made under pressure, survival against odds. The piggyback flight also teaches us about institutional resistance to unusual events. When the first reports reached 8th Air Force headquarters, officers refused to believe them. The incident was too strange, too improbable. Only when multiple sources confirmed it did the military accept that this had actually happened. Organizations tend to reject information that doesn't fit established patterns. This is dangerous in warfare, where the unexpected is routine. The Japanese didn't believe the Americans could bomb Tokyo in 1942 until Doolittle's raiders appeared overhead. The Germans didn't believe the Allies would land at Normandy until the invasion fleet was visible from shore. Military history is full of surprises that shouldn't have been surprises if anyone had paid attention to unlikely possibilities. In business and technology today, this same pattern repeats. Companies dismiss innovations that contradict conventional wisdom. Kodak invented digital photography, but failed to pursue it because it threatened their film business. Blockbuster rejected Netflix's partnership offer because streaming seemed impractical. Established institutions struggled to accept new ideas, especially from outsiders. Glenn Rojohn's story is a reminder that sometimes the impossible just means nobody's done it yet. And here's a detail that most people don't know: a final piece of the puzzle that was classified for 50 years and only revealed when documents were declassified in the 1990s. The German officer who captured Glenn and Bill, Captain Klaus Weber, wrote a report about the piggyback flight to his superiors. In that report, Weber recommended that Germany immediately surrender. His reasoning was brutally logical. If the Americans had pilots capable of flying wrecked aircraft for 12 miles, if their crews were so determined that they would continue fighting under conditions that would break German morale, then Germany had already lost. The report was filed and ignored. Weber survived the war and emigrated to Canada, where he became an airline pilot. In 1982, he attended an aviation history conference in Toronto and met Glenn Rojohn for the first time since the capture. The two men, former enemies, shared a drink and talked about that impossible flight. Weber told Glenn something he'd never told anyone. "When I saw what you did, I knew we were finished. Not because of technology or numbers, but because of will. You wouldn't quit. We already had." Glenn Rojohn died in 2014 at age 94. He'd lived a full life, raised a family, worked as a crop duster and flight instructor, taught hundreds of young pilots to fly. His obituary in the local North Dakota newspaper mentioned his military service briefly. It didn't mention the piggyback flight. His family held a small funeral. A few elderly veterans attended. The Air Force sent a representative who presented an American flag to Glenn's widow. And that was it. No parade, no national news coverage, just a quiet goodbye to a man who'd done something impossible and spent 70 years not talking about it. Bill Leak had died 5 years earlier in 2009. Before he passed, he'd written a memoir that was published privately, just 100 copies for family and friends. In the memoir, he wrote about the piggyback flight and his friendship with Glenn. The final line of the memoir was, "I owed Glenn my life. He always said he owed me his. We were both right. That's what crew means." From a North Dakota farm kid with a dream of flying to a legend who inspired thousands of airmen across 7 decades of aviation history, Glenn Rojohn proved that courage isn't about fearlessness. It's about functioning despite fear. He demonstrated that survival sometimes requires breaking every rule in the book and trusting your instincts when training fails. And because of his actions on December 31st, 1944, 10 men lived instead of dying. Families welcomed loved ones home instead of receiving telegrams, and generations of pilots learned that the impossible is only impossible until someone does it. That's the power of refusing to quit. That's the legacy of one farm kid who looked at 2 destroyed airplanes locked together in midair and decided he was going to fly that thing home. And incredibly impossibly, against every law of physics and probability, he did. Remember his name, Glenn Rojohn. Remember what he proved: that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they absolutely have to. And remember that somewhere right now, someone is facing their own impossible situation, and they need to know that survival is possible. Because if Glenn could fly 2 B-17s for 12 miles through fire and flak, then anything is possible. Anything.